We are going to change gears after having discussed in the beginning of the morning. We discussed the impact of COVID in the international trade. We just had the discussion with trade remedies, and now we have the pleasure to have Professor Petros Mavroidis. He's already online, and we are going to discuss multilateralism. We know that we have been having many different developments. We had a change in the US government that led to a change in commercial policy in that very important player in the international trade. We have a new leadership in the WTO. So there are issues, there are points there to be discussed, and we have the honor of having Professor Petros Mavroidis again in Iraq. We had a professor perhaps 1.5 years ago with us in one of our meetings, and today we have him for the keynote speaker for initiating our seminar. Professor, thank you very much for the time, and we appreciate that you join us.
René Medrado asked me to speak a bit about, offer my views on what is the best or the most, let's say, efficient way for the WTO to become policy relevant again. So my argument is on slide number 1, and I make 2 points. First, that I say that the WTO is in dire straits. I think this comes close to the understatement of the year. And for the WTO, because of its objective function to become the multilateral home for trade, once again, it has to resolve 2 crises, not just one: legislative inertia and judiciary crisis. And in my view, the latter is by far the easiest to fathom, by far. Now, why do I say this? Well, because unlike other organizations, the objective function of the WTO is to bring about a rules-based system which will liberalize international trade, and of course, administer disputes which might arise from alleged lack of adequate enforcement or adequate implementation of the rules-based system. And nowadays, both functions are malfunctioning, to put it, to quip, if you wish. So I'll make 4 points. First, why, in my view, the 2 crises are connected. Then I'll discuss the crisis of the judiciary, which in my view is the easier to resolve. Then the crisis of the legislative. And then I'll explain why I don't share the optimism of many people who, in my view, see maybe too much in the change of government in the US. Let me start with why, in my view, the 2 crises are connected. Now, just to place it in context, the WTO saw the light of day when we were living, if you wish, the apex of economic liberalism, no? This was a time when Berlin Wall went down. Most countries seemed to espouse the so-called Washington Consensus. There was practically no opposition to a number of far-fetched agreements negotiated in the Uruguay round, which 10 years before in the Tokyo round were, there we are. Now I can see it. Excellent. So if you can go down to Fukuyama, a few slides down, because I spoke about the first part. This I said it. Next. Próximo, próximo, próximo. Muito bem. And now the next slide. Excellent. So that's where I was. I was explaining that in my view, I mean, the WTO, people saw too much in the WTO, and they didn't realize this was a very particular moment in history. It was not that the history ended as Fukuyama, who used to be a member of the Bush father administration before becoming a professor, called the end of history. Actually, this was a very optimistic view. Now, the WTO comes at a point in time where everybody thinks that liberalism has turned the page to all other possible regimes and went a little bit too fast between what I term cohabitate and co-decide. It's one thing to say I have UNCTAD or the UN, where we meet, discuss, and do not affect each other's policies. It's a different thing to say I have an institution which will decide on how a number of policies will be run at the domestic level. And heterogeneity is much more of an obstacle when it comes to speaking on co-decision. Unfortunately, heterogeneity was severely undermined or underestimated by those who finished the Uruguay round. Next slide, please. Now, why do I say that two crises are communicating vessels? I say make a very simple assumption. Let's assume that by magic wand, tomorrow, there is no more judiciary crisis at the WTO. The US and everybody else agrees. We go back to where we were before the Trump administration started blocking one appointment after the other. Fine. Now, what will those courts do? Well, the WTO courts will be resolving disputes about agreements which were negotiated and signed in the 20th century. There's only one multilateral agreement ever since, and not, I would say, the most dramatic one, the Agreement on Trade Facilitation. Now, compare the agenda in free trade areas, and especially those free trade areas at the World Bank. There is an excellent study by Michele Ruta, he was the lead economist, Aditya Matu, I think, and one more, Rocha, Aditya Rocha. They were the three main editors, what they term deep trade agreements. And just look at the agenda, what kind of concerns trading nations have and how they place them and express them in DTAs. And then compare with the WTO, where all we have is the ATF. Now, modern concerns, I think, are those expressed in DTAs. And disputes, of course, will originate in areas the trading nations care about. If I don't care about something, why on earth should I dispute? So I'm not saying that solving the crisis is meaningless, not at all. All I'm saying is solving the judiciary crisis is not the end of the road. Eventually, the WTO has to become policy relevant again. Because if it continues the road towards irrelevance, having or not having dispute adjudication will not take us very far. Next slide, please. Now, the crisis of the judiciary. Here, I don't have to spend too much time. We all know the appellate body is no more. But of course, the point is not the appellate body is no more. The point is, why go to the panel if the other party can appeal into the void? This will be at best a Pyrrhic victory. I win before a panel. Okay, and surprise, surprise, the respondent, as it happened, I counted 21 cases so far, the respondent appeals, but there is no appellate body to adjudicate the appeal. So I won, but I won nothing. Now look a little bit at the numbers. To my calculation, I think to everybody's calculation, 24 disputes on average between 95 and 2019, 5 in 2020, 7 in 2021. Now, is there any insurance policy against the appellate body in abeyance? Well, yeah, there is. Ad hoc agreements between the parties, but they are infrequent because what is the incentive of the potentially losing party? Because more or less you know where, if you're winning or if you're losing the argument, to sign this. I found 2 agreements to this effect. The MPIA, the multilateral, this EU-China agreement hasn't persuaded the memberships, and I don't need the membership, and I don't need to tell you that so far there are no disputes, no reports issued by the MPIA. Paradoxically, still there is no foreign diversion. We don't see an explosion of cases at the FTA level, but this might have to do with contract completion at the FTA level more than with anything else. But as things stand, the way I read the record is, well, the judiciary doesn't work and people don't litigate elsewhere. Next slide, please. The next, okay. Now, when we talk about crisis of the legislative in the WTO, I put a title here, Strong Headwinds. I hope you appreciate that all my titles are in green and yellow, which is the national colors of the Seleção. Also the subtitle, same thing, green and yellow. Now, what are the strong headwinds? I mean, I can do a very long list, but my ordinal preference, if you wish. China's participation has led to agreement in some quarters. I'm not discussing here the merits. If we have time, we can discuss later, but it's clear that China's participation is not what at least the two transatlantic partners thought it would look like 20 years after its accession. FTAs monopolize the trade agenda, but they are tolerated, although there is a clearly variable geometry. I mean, look at the kind of obligations all those signing FTAs assume at the FTA level and compare with the WTO. But the funny thing is that intra-WTO variable geometry, the so-called JSIs, joint statement initiatives, are viewed with hostility. So the WTO membership allows trading nations to go and negotiate all sorts of things in the FTA context, many of which, quite frankly, are of dubious legality. But when this discussion takes place inside the WTO, they're hostile to the idea. And then, I mean, there are a number of other issues which become bigger and bigger by the day, and no solution is obvious, at least not for now. Subsidies. You had before in the previous panel, Professor Dr. Volker Graftsma. I work a lot with his colleague, Edwin, and we're discussing a couple of recent cases, where you have a Chinese company subsidizing a Chinese subsidiary which exports to Europe. And you ask yourself, what can I do under the subsidies agreement? Now, the subsidies agreement was negotiated for all practical purposes between 92 and 93. When the Clinton administration came to power, they had a different change of heart vis-a-vis the Bush administration. They found the common grounds with the EU and they did the agreement. But this was before the emergence of global value chains. There was a safe assumption to say that production is national. There was not so much offshoring, outsourcing, all the things which are commonplace terminology nowadays. So what do you do with my example under the subsidies agreement? It's very difficult to square the European measures. Let's say Europe imposes countervailing duties and say they're illegal, even though the subsidy is not provided by Egyptians. S&D, special and differential treatment. What are the quid pro quos here? Everybody speaking and screaming about, oh, people abuse, China should never be fine. But whose incentive is it to sit down and negotiate those things seriously when they don't see the quid pro quos in the negotiation, and so on and so forth? I want to insist on one point here, and this is my next slide, por favor. Now, I will explain the slide in a different way than I wrote it, although I stand by what I wrote, of course. I will start from the last PowerPoint. In the 70s, parenthetically, I say that one of the best books I've read about the history, there are two actually, the history of the GATT, are the book by Jones on the Kennedy round and the book by Gil Winham on the Tokyo round. Now, what do these books say? These books say, look, as the GATT becomes more and more heterogeneous because it aspires to become a global institution, you cannot expect everyone to participate in the same negotiation, especially when the negotiation concerns behind the border measures. Now, you don't need to tell you that preferences are endogenously set in a WTO setting, and they reflect a number of things, from cultural preferences to, but crucially also the level of development. So if I am Denmark, or Switzerland, and I have solved a number of other problems, then of course I care about environment very much. I care about to what extent plastic is recyclable, and I draft legislation to this effect. But if I'm a sub-Saharan African country, and my big problem is find food, nutrition for my people, then you can imagine I couldn't care two shoots about environment. Why should I take a seat at the negotiation on concerning TBT plus and so on and so forth? This is exactly what prompted the trading nations in the 70s to say, okay, the willing coalitions can come in and discuss a series of behind-the-border measures. Now, maybe because we thought, and I go back to Fukuyama, that was the end of history, that the Uruguay round came with this epithet, single undertaking, whatever it means. But more for practically, it means we all leave the door at the same time, having signed the same agreements. Does it make sense? Does it make sense, seriously, when today's concerns, as expressed in FTAs, are drastically different from the WTO, to expect from all the membership to sign all possible agreements? I mean, how many sub-Saharan African states care about the ozone layer, or I can give you 20, climate change and so on? And even if they do care, do they have the money to go ahead and do it? And by the way, did Switzerland or Denmark, the examples I gave you before, care about the ozone layer when they had other more pressing problems to solve 100 years ago? So to me, the Tokyo formula was abandoned way too fast and without much thinking. Next slide, please, and we're approaching the end now slowly. Yeah, here we are. The basic point I try to make in this slide is that there is a trade-off between deepening and widening. If you want to go behind the border and discuss behind the border instruments, these are not 6-digit tariffs where we can all sit around the table and say, well, okay, textiles, I go from 15 to 12%, but you go from 10 to 8% for cars, and so on and so forth. Here we discuss behind the border measures, we discuss regulations essentially. And regulations, you cannot just say I eliminate regulations. Regulations address distortions. So when I discuss regulation, there is a quest for rationalization, not for elimination. Now, if this is correct, and I think it is quite correct, well, then by definition, those who will participate in the negotiation are those who share the concern, not those who will try to have a trade advantage by saying less TBT for more. These things don't work this way. Now, how can this happen? Well, we have to incite variable geometry. We have to rethink in the WTO, I think, the attitude towards, for example, JSIs. I'm not saying that non-participants should pay. No, not at all. But you can do inter-se agreements in a way that those who don't participate do not suffer. Because remember, anyway, Brazil, for example, might tomorrow say, I will adopt the most demanding legislation concerning banks because I'm very afraid of runs against bank. You can do it legally. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And you have national treatment, and you say, those who meet my standards come into the market. Well, Brazil might say, allow anyone to come into the market as long as you meet my standards. And maybe only one or two meet those standards. Well, that's exactly what we discuss when we discuss behind the border. Would you rather see Brazil do it by itself or with 5 like-minded Brazils? And the WTO attitude, in my view, towards this point must change. And also, the other point is rethink a little bit the umbilical cord between WTO and FTAs. In the WTO nowadays, the moment an FTA, there is a multilateral review in the CRTA. There is no decision, of course, because it's all transparency. well, the train has left the station. Why not have a mechanism, use TPR maybe, to see what kind of issues do they discuss in those FTAs? How do they go about completing the WTO contract? Where do I find commonalities across FTAs? And how much of this I can bring under the WTO roof? Next and last slide, please. Excellent. So what I'm telling you is there is no kumbaya in the WTO. We're not all on the same page. That's clearly not the case. Look at the negotiations. Fisheries is a great example. You go to the WTO webpage and you think that it's a question of a few hours before the agreement has been signed. And then when you speak to the negotiators, the people who participate in the negotiation, you realize they are miles apart. There is uncertainty surrounding JSIs. There are people going there spending time in negotiating, and God knows if the outcome will be MFN compatible, consistent, if somebody will take it to the court. Now, we have all these problems, and the new US government cares about labor standards. Quite frankly, in my view, totally counterproductive. This is not, if I were USTR, if I were Catherine Tai, as much as Hene and me, we love her because of her former association with our common friend, David Palmer, I would tell her, no, this is not a starter. Priority should be the judiciary crisis, because even though I don't think we should stop there, as I said before, and then just to have some sort of a low-hanging fruit, and then move to discuss the big issues, the legislative inaction. But I'm afraid we're bereft of leaders. Europe, I don't think anyone in his or her right frame of mind should expect anything from the European Union in this respect. Just look at what's happening now in Afghanistan, which is portrayed only as a migration crisis, and then you understand what I'm talking about when I say lack of leadership in Europe. China has its own agenda, of course, and the US, I don't think for the US WTO is a priority. So I am not very optimistic about the future of the WTO, and with this I conclude my intervention.
Thank you, Professor. I can see from your comments that you are referring to the GATT à la carte era, when we didn't have a single undertaking, which was, of course, the norm of the Uruguay round. And it seems that this is really happening if we take the trilateral agreement on government procurement, some initiatives on electronic commerce, also on investments, also is still incipient. And the fact that all the FTAs, and I like the TA use that you made. Of course, we are referring to the transatlantic agreements, or even the agreement TPP, and now the CPTPP. It's clear that they are going more deep than the WTO has gone, especially on environmental issues and so on. So it's very interesting to see your views. Do you think the WTO will continue expanding, or do you see that we have probably reached a point that from now on the way forward is really on specialization of topics that the countries will adhere depending on their specific issues? And I'm checking also whether there are questions, and I'll share with you the questions.
Hay preguntas. You see, it's very difficult to predict the future, but I mean, in the short run, I don't think the US will change its attitude. I mean, every time the USTR speaks, I hear two things: labor standards, and we continue talking. I don't see any leadership. The WTO Secretariat does not have the power to go ahead and propose. They have to play, they keep repeating, member-driven institution. There is no leadership in the EU at all on trade. So quite frankly, I cannot see the WTO doing anything before the beginning of next year when a few elections take place in Europe, which are important, and then maybe they might say, okay, now at least let's address the judiciary. Quite frankly, I also hope that the ministerial conference will be a failure, because only if they realize that the investment they made on fisheries and so on did not pay off, then maybe they will start focusing on the actual questions. If they end up with something on fisheries, quite frankly, they will realize sooner rather than later that it was nothing. First of all, it's a minute issue to start with. It's a non-issue for the majority of WTO members, and it does not address the question of the judiciary. So you have a new agreement, let's assume. Who will adjudicate the disputes? Again, you take me to a panel and I appeal to the void. That's why I'm not very optimistic, my dear René. And you have to come to New York soon. You haven't been here for a long time.
Absolutely. We do have a question, Professor, from Professor Vera Tortensen. She is making
the young Brazilian delegate. Yeah.
Yes, another Brazilian delegate. She's asking whether we are going to see an explosion of PTAs. Adding to that point, my question is whether these 20s look like the 30s of the last century, when in the interwar period, where we saw also an increase in unilateral actions from the countries, and whether that will also be the case, if not so aggressive, at least a concentration of unilateral policy, trade policy.
First of all, abraço a Vera. And then, in my view, we see it already. I mean, look at what is going on. Everybody discusses with everybody outside the WTO. In 3 weeks from now, I will be at the IMF to compare RCEP with CPTPP. Now, if you look at those two agreements, you have a very substantial amount of world trade in two agreements, which are opening up to new guys. Especially CPTPP wants to have all of APEC inside eventually. And if I'm an APEC country and I'm not a member of CPTPP, honestly, my dear René, what would I do? Would I say, should I invest in the WTO with all the uncertainties, or in CPTPP where I can go further, faster, and I can end up somewhere? I mean, it's only rational now that people invest in the FTA route. I think it is a perfectly rational trade policy.
Very good. Professor, I want to thank you for being here with us.
Obrigadíssimo. Obrigadíssimo. Foi prazer
muito
para
obrigado
mim. Prazer para mim.
Muito obrigado.
You have
Nós
to come
vamos
to New
mudar
York
aqui para o
soon.
português.
Sempre
Yes, we
português.
have to go back to Geneva, to New York, where you are. It will be a pleasure to be there. Thank you very much for participating, for opening the seminar. And I know that you have a day long of hearings there. So thank you for taking the time to be with us. And now I'll switch to Portuguese. Amanhã vamos começar novamente às 9 da manhã. Temos 2 painéis. E agradeço a audiência de todos, a participação. Não se esqueçam de mandar perguntas pelo Q&A, sempre nos painéis. E amanhã nós vamos começar com um painel relacionado a justamente as negociações internacionais de comércio, às 9, e às 10h30, um outro painel sobre iniciativas de comércio relativas ao carbono, as propostas concretas de regulamentação da Comissão Europeia e o projeto de lei norte-americano. Prazer a todos e até amanhã.